Okay, so um after a couple of days of over reading the American uh current American state of affairs, we have the um first round of the snap election in France, and I decided that we needed to hear from an expert. So I invited my colleague and friend, Dr. Nevena Trajkov. Um, I guess a lot of uh, concern among political scientists today on Twitter was, for one moment, keeping us off from the debate debacle conversation. So um, I'm thrilled to have a conversation with you, Nevena, but also I think um I want to hear from you about the impact this is going to have beyond France and the European Union. So I want to hear your first thoughts about this preliminary, because it's not over. So the floor is yours.
Right. Well, as we were talking in messages on WhatsApp, where all good political analysis happens now. As I mentioned to you, I typically don't panic about politics often, right? Even after the debate on Thursday and all the grumblings happening about President Biden and his nomination in the Democratic Party, I wasn't panicking. But what I saw today in France sent me into a panic, because this has the potential for some really dangerous, detrimental sequence of cascades that you may think it's contained to France, but we have to look at this in the larger context. France is one of the pillars of the European Union, right? After Brexit, the European Union went back to mostly France and Germany, which are the two countries that, that you don't want to say founded the European Union, but that agreement they had after the Second World War started the inspiration for the European Union. These are the two largest economies in that union. The turn of France towards the right, and as we were talking, Le Pen and the National Rally did not get the majority. There is another far-right party, the Republicans. They got about 10% of the vote. Collectively, they still don't have a majority. But we are inching towards that 50% of the far right in France. And the challenge, as I mentioned, is on July 7th, if they don't get the majority, the left, which is now this amazing coalition, I mean, amazing in the truest sense, of communists, socialists, and centrists, they might get a majority, but they're going to have a very difficult time forming government, particularly when Mélenchon, who is so divisive, I don't want to say pro-Russian viewpoints, but soft on Russia viewpoints, has already declared that he's ready to be prime minister, right? And that entire conversation is already like, well, who told you were going to do that? Whereas on the right, they have a clear candidate for prime minister. And so even if there is no government formed after July 7th, the situation in France is as follows. You have a far-right coalition nearing 50%. And we still don't know. Maybe this will inspire more people to come out of the woods in France that support the right? Because really, it's been taboo. It's been a bit of an embarrassing thing, like, oh, I'm not going to go vote for the fascists, or I'm not going to go vote for the far right. By the way, in France, the National Rally, Marine Le Pen's coalition, they actually sued to not be labeled far right or extremist, and they lost in court. So legally, they are considered a far right party associated with fascism. If this then inspires others to come out, knowing how close this group is to getting towards 50%, that is a concern. Best case for Macron, there is no government that forms, right? But then it sends France into another round of elections, and people are still very resentful. Macron has become a slur word in France today, right? Particularly from the right. He's the one who brought this on. The scoping out now a little bit more, let's say the right does manage to conjure up some more votes next week. Let's say they are able to form a government. You have a very real risk of massive disruption within the European Union, because we know that the far right and the extremists do not have a favorable view of the European Union. You have the emboldening of the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, in Germany, who during this last round of parliamentary elections for the European Parliament came in second in Germany, its best performance ever. You have this pillar now of extremists, pardon me, in France, now going to provide even more encouragement to Orban in Hungary, who today announced a new coalition of this Patriotic for Europe, consisting of far-right parties, two in particular from the Czech Republic or Czechia and Austria. And you have this energy across that continent that is gearing towards something very familiar and very uncomfortable for those of us from Europe. My family is from there. That sounds a lot and feels uncomfortably like the late 20s and the 1930s. And again, if you have one, never mind both pillars of France and Germany leaning right, this is a problem. Scoping it out even further now, if Donald Trump wins the presidency, given the chaos here in the United States with the Democrats right now, the idea was always that at least the Europeans will be able to balance it out, right? And if we have Le Pen, Orban, the Alternative for Deutschland, who today also announced that Le Pen has now provided the model for the right in Europe, if there is no balance, you have to wonder what liberal democracy in the current world order is going to look like. And as I wrote earlier, the real winner today or this week is Vladimir Putin, right? There is no question about that.
Yeah.
Between the National Front, the National Rally, who today elected members to parliament that are openly pro-Kremlin, and Orban in Hungary, and now the questioning of President Biden and his candidacy, Moscow, or at least the Kremlin, is very happy.
Nevena, I agree with you on this frame, big picture of where we are entering, the phase we're entering. And I know we don't have time to discuss democracy right now and the erosion or backsliding, but I just want to get your take on how this connection you're making with the result today in France, the strengthening of extreme far right political actors in the European community of nations. How does that move these countries closer to a scenario of, fragmentation of the project of the European Union? Do you think this is going to be something even bigger than Brexit?
It has the potential to be, Maria, and I don't, you know me, that I don't speak in hyperbole, that I don't speak in dramatic ways. the National Rally and Marine Le Pen for a long time, just, you know, her party in itself, never mind this coalition of the National Rally, they have been a thorn in the side in Brussels. Their rhetoric is constant, mirrors a lot of what Orban says and a lot of, frankly, of what Trump says. This conversation, this narrative of our sovereignty is being violated for the global order, right? And when it comes to Brussels, even today in Brussels, after the election, there was a closed door meeting of what are we going to do if the National Rally and Le Pen and her brand take over in France. If anything, this is a signal for the rest of Europe. The anti-European Union stance that these groups have, right? And they sell it, and you heard Le Pen today using that populist rhetoric of we're now returning power to the people, right? We're now going to tell these larger groups to kind of buzz off a little bit and return sovereignty to France. These are the conversations that are happening across Europe. But up until recently, it's been, but the European project has brought peace. The European project, meaning the Union, has brought stability. The European project has brought economic wealth. But at the state level, there are plenty of people who are not educated enough or in the rural areas who haven't benefited from the European project, and they feel, not to sound trite, but left behind. And this is where a lot of that support is coming. And weirdly enough, as we were talking, the thing I think that I still cannot get over is that because in France, the left, and this is indicative of Europe in general, their backing is toward, if we go to the Gaza and Israel conflict, the war, their backing is for the Palestinians. And you saw it today when Mélenchon was speaking. There was a woman next to him wearing the scarf of the Palestinians, signaling to France and to the Arab and to the Muslim population of France that this is the party for you, which, because they're a coalition of communists and coalition of socialists, they say this is where you belong. But where does that leave the Jewish population of France? Today we saw France's Jewish population, that has the largest Jewish population of Europe, vote for the National Rally, a party whose foundations, or I should say a coalition whose foundations, is from the Nazi Party. It is mind-blowing to me that this is now how populations, minority populations, or national or multi-ethnic, or people with multiple identities, this is how they are now rationally in their minds voting. That yes, you know, during World War II, this party or this coalition was founded by Nazis, but now as a Jew in France, or somebody who is Jewish in France, I'm now going to vote for them because the other side is pro-Palestinian, and Mélenchon himself has repeatedly said anti-Semitic statements. So it is between that and the anti-EU rhetoric that comes out of the right, and this populist rhetoric of returning power to the people, you know, we're under cultural attack. This front is anti-Islamic, anti-Arab. 2015 with the migrations from the Middle East, particularly from the Syrian war, really did trigger even more, or deepen, I should say, more of the sentiment. All of this collective cultural attacks that they feel that they're under, populist rhetoric of returning power to the people, of sovereignty to the people, or sovereignty to the nation, blaming the European Union for bad policies that has taken them, taken the sovereignty away from them, or European Union policies towards globalization that have left behind those that didn't have the skills to participate in globalization. All of that leads to, well, if the British could do it, well, maybe the French can do it. And the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany is already organizing for the same, like I said, today they said, we have a model in France. By the way, one more thing about Germany, the AfD organized their convention today in Western Germany in the area of Essen. And tens of thousands of protesters showed up, and it got violent. I mean, that's another story that we can't even talk about because we're so inundated with these other things, but tens of thousands of protesters showed up in Essen today in Germany to protest the convention of the Alternative for Deutschland, right? And it was a violent protest. It turned out to be violent. So it has been quite, since Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, it has been quite a 4 days between
Yeah.
the United States and European politics.
But I want to go back to two things. Um, Putin is celebrating as
Yes,
well as Xi Jinping. They are
yes.
both celebrating. And my concern is that how are the Baltic nations feeling tonight?
The Baltic nations, of being Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, are not feeling warm and fuzzy. They're feeling, and including, I would say, I would put Poland in that group as well.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Yeah, they are feeling vulnerable. They are feeling that when the chips are down, no one will show up. Because the other thing, we talked about the European Union, but the national rally and these far-right groups in France, across Europe as well, they are not Fisk here as well. So they are looking at France, and when you have nearly 50% of the population of France voting for a coalition that is anti-NATO, anti-EU, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, anti-globalization, right? And then they saw what happened on Thursday here, and there's a real fear in Europe now that Donald Trump will be reelected. We've got 4 countries, and maybe even Finland should be in that group. 5 countries that are looking at everyone and saying, you're not going to come. If Putin comes in, you will not come. And frankly, all they have to do is look at Ukraine
Exactly.
as an example.
Exactly. But my question is, Brexit is today considered by British public opinion as a huge mistake. Isn't that a lesson for Europe? What's wrong there? What is the disconnect between the lessons that Brexit left and this?
Well, Thursday will tell, really, how much of a lesson they've learned. Thursday, the British have their, or I should say the United Kingdom has their parliamentary elections, right?
Yes.
And it doesn't really look good for the Conservatives right now, but let's see what happens on Thursday. Because Labour and some of the other parties aren't as organized as they could be either, right? So we'll see what happens on Thursday in the UK, or to see if they've really learned their lesson. But one thing that I always emphasize, when you study Europe and you look at the European Union, yes, it's a European Union, but the European Union itself is not a state, right? It's a collection of states. And at the end of the day, states will assert sovereignty when the chips are down. And so, they can look at Brexit and they can see, well, they survived, but then they look at their currency and they look at the British pound and it's not the same, right? Croatia, for example, just went on to the euro this last year, within the last 2 years, I should say. And their kuna, the previous currency, the national currency, it was not very strong. If they decide to leave the European Union, maybe it's a close enough transition they could, transition back without that much pain. But if you look at some of the other currencies, particularly let's say in Germany, the Deutschmark has been long gone for a while, right? Or in Greece, the drachma has been gone for a long. What's going to happen in Greece? Right? The pound, the return to the pound, because the pound was always a stable valued currency, was a much, we were concerned, but it turned out to be a much smaller risk than, let's say, a drachma or the German mark or a French franc, right? So it'll be interesting to see how the individual states respond, but at the end of the day, the states are going to respond in a sovereign way that's best for their countries, that's best for their people. But all these leaders know that the minute that their populations endure real economic hardships, it also brings instability to their countries, right? At home. And again, no one's coming to help. So there is just a whole gamut of insecurities and uncertainties right now across the continent. And again, this for us, and this is why I'm so concerned that the American media is not as analytical about what's happening in France as our conversation is because, like I said, for us, we have so much uncertainty in this country. And hearing Donald Trump say what he said at the debate on Thursday, there is no one, or there is the potential to not having anyone there to balance Trump out at the world stage, which, as we know in political science, then opens up opportunities for Moscow or Beijing to reestablish and a narrative of what the world order would be, and that then will make our lives extremely uncomfortable here in the West.
Nevena, finally, how do we, from the liberal democracy, Western democracy, how do we fight this ethno-nationalist? I don't think it's a wave. I think it's an earthquake. What can we do from not just as political scientists, but let's hope people who are not in the discipline, but just regular people, regular voters, citizens in general. What is it that we need to understand that is our duty? Because we can't rely on political leaders alone. And right now, that's really not the case. So, what is it that can be done to fight these traits, political, populist offers?
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's a question of values of liberal democracy or ethnicities or things like that. A few years back, I was in a very, we'll call it a healthy conversation with a well-known political scientist who wrote a book with one of my old professors about a cultural backlash, right? And that's what's driving the far right. That to me sounded wrong because being from Europe, my question to her was, let me backtrack. Their ultimate finding was that older traditional individuals are voting for the far right. They are the ones who are driving the far right. And they used data from a survey they did. But to which I said, yeah, but I'm the one who goes to Europe and to see my family, and it's not the old people that are showing up, it's the young people that are showing up. And that conversation stuck with me because we got into a healthy debate about that. And so I started researching it. I'm actually working on a paper right now where I studied this very phenomenon. Like, what is driving the right? Is it really culture? Because if it's culture, Maria, then that's a very hard thing to change, right? Culture is slow. It's one of those thicker, not to quote Geertz, but those thicker elements to change. But I found that it wasn't culture. It wasn't culture. It had everything to do with faith in institutions. It had everything to do with understanding how your institutions work. It had everything to do with linking your economics and economic success to your government, to your institutions. And so, in my opinion, it's less about ethnicity, it's less about identity politics. That's just an outlet for
Mhm.
disgruntlement, right? In my opinion, it needs to come down to one, educating our societies again on how our institutions operate, educating our societies again on how our governments operate. And then two, really, and I mean, and not to sound a little bit like a populist, but really uh, uh, reinstating and rebuilding that trust between individuals and their government and institutions. So that when they are feeling left behind or unprepared for a globalized world, that they have this outlet, their political outlet through institutions, or I should say a resource to go to say, I can't survive, I'm not educated enough, I don't have the tools, my farm doesn't have the updates to participate. And that there is this relationship that happens again. Right now, there is such a disconnect between people and their relationships with their institutions and government that they are now using culture, homophobia, anti-Semitism, all of that as their outlet to express disgruntledness. You
Mhm.
know, my family is from the Balkans. And one of the, and Milosevic and everybody was just surprised at how Milosevic was just so quickly able to unravel that country. But it wasn't quick. It was a decades-long process that started after Tito died in the 1980s, and it was an economic disaster. And in the end, the outlet to express that disgruntlement of economic suffering, particularly in southern Serbia, where the biggest nationalists were, I mean, and that's not a coincidence, was ethnic scapegoating. And so that's why you see that those that are under-resourced, that don't feel a connection to their institutions, that don't believe that the institutions work for them, those are the ones that then turn ultra-nationalistic,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So, in my opinion, it has nothing to do with culture. You cannot teach someone about the merits of how same-sex marriage should be equal to a traditional marriage, or how Islam is actually an evolution of Christianity if you look at it historically, right? Or, you can talk until you're blue in the face. That's not going to resonate because that's not the problem. Does that make sense?
It does. My concern is that what we're seeing, like you said, it's used as a scapegoat, but the stakes are so high, not just here in the US, but in general. We are looking at a profound anti-immigrant sentiment here in the US, in Europe, and the consequences of the election in France and probably the ripple effect is going to have, broadly speaking, across the European Union and the institutions, right? You were making references to these meetings in Brussels, but also here. We tend to think that political decisions have no immediate impact on people. But after that Chevron decision on Friday and possibly tomorrow with the immunity decision, we're going to look into a different, we're having already a very different political landscape here in the US. And it's connected to the livelihoods of people
Mhm.
probably with immigrant origin or with members of minority groups, and their lives are going to be completely appended if these changes continue to happen. And we have, I mean, as political scientists, we know that what's happening is a backlash, and it might take uh, a long time for us to see if we're lucky to see any reverse in this course. So I guess yeah, it's I think it's a very dark moment. But
Yeah, it's something that is going to take a long time to remedy, right?
mhm,
Uh, one of the things, I shouldn't say things, one of the models to look at could be Germany, post-war Germany, for how they extinguished not entirely, but at least, put out most of the fires of anti-Semitism. But that required very strict laws on what can and cannot be said. Statues were taken down, monuments were replaced. I don't know if in American democracy those same things would fly,
Yeah.
right? So that is the real question.
Mhm.
How do we heal this in the United States? The good news is I'm hopeful in that 200 million Americans don't follow the anti-immigrant narrative here in the United States. So that's the majority voice. If we can focus on that and empower those people and empower that narrative and
Mhm.
perpetuate that narrative, that will begin to mitigate the threat that we have to our immigrant population and minority populations. But it's a long project.
And you mentioned the operative uh, uh strategy here is civic education. We need a more educated society, knowledgeable on how does government work. um oh, you can't build trust on government if people don't know what it's supposed to do and
Well,
how you're supposed to engage.
well, trust, if you remember, we're political scientists and I have to dab into sociology. Trust is this thing that is got two components, right? An action and a reciprocation,
Hmm.
right? I don't know
Exactly.
if you read Coleman ever, but Coleman, I read Coleman in, oh my gosh, 20 years ago when I did my PhD the first time, and it always stuck with me. It found its way into my dissertation and everything, right? But you have trust and reciprocation, or I should say an action and reciprocation.
Mm.
And the more that somebody does an action and then there's an expected behavioral reciprocation, the more that that is repeated, you begin to trust that interaction, that A gives to B and B is going to behave in a way, an expected way to A. So yes, you can teach about institutions, but there also needs to be this exchange and reciprocation that people can trust. And this
Exactly.
is particularly important for those who are, again, feeling that globalization has negatively impacted their lives,
Mhm.
right? That then they use the narrative that immigrants are taking our jobs, right? Not to quote the former president, but those Black and Hispanic jobs,
The black
right?
jobs. The
Right?
black jobs.
There needs to, the institutions, yes, it's important that they need to understand how institutions work. We all need to
Yes.
understand how our institutions work, and unfortunately, we're very deficient in that. But particularly for that population, that trust needs to be rebuilt between themselves and the institution. There needs to
Mhm.
be an action of, let's say, giving taxes, and then the institution needs to reciprocate with taxes being used to benefit them while still being able to enter a globalized world, but so that that individual who is paying taxes is also reaping the benefit from it, right? So it's a multi-pronged approach. It takes time. It does take time, but right now that trust, that reciprocation is non-existent.
Yeah. Well, thank you for this emergency conversation. I think my level of stress is the same, but at least I think I have more clarity on what I should stress. So thank you for joining me in my
No, it's okay.
in my need to clarify this with an expert like you, and I appreciate it. Let's hope we don't have the need to call for an emergency
Yeah.
podcast. But thank you.
No
Thank you
problem. Well,
very
like
much.
I said, I don't generally panic, but
Yeah,
France
me
today
too.
got me a little bit, gave me some heart palpitations.
Yes.
So,
Yes. So
yeah,
I'll um I'll look forward to having a more hopeful conversation next time.
yes.